Yes, you go right after it. If someone has a question, Tom?
Hi, Tom. I would like to know how the work of Roses and John, Serpents and Bates, Tony Fredton, has influenced on work.
So I didn't hear the first one, but I think I can guess who it was.
I would like to know how the work of Caruso and John.
So Caruso, St. John, Tony Fredton, Sergis and Bates, all that lot. You can see it making a buzz. You can see that slightly irritating me. No, I'm only joking. They're very close. They're all friends to some extent. And everybody's related. So you're talking about a very small circle of London architects. So I was taught by Tony Fredton. So I was taught by Tony Fredton. My partner Steph was taught by Peter St. John. So Tony is like the grandfather of the generation. Then so St. John and Sergis and Bates are the next generation under. Then we're the next generation under that, and then it kind of carries on. So you could say it has all the affection and influence and tension and rejection of a kind of family relationship. If that can make sense. So of course, like if let's say of course their work is very important to us, particularly for me, particularly Tony Fredton. He was a very, very inspiring teacher. And of course, if let's say some of those architects are attacked, then we very naturally defend them as being really great architects and people that we really admire. Of course, if anybody compares us to them, we reject it, right? You know, it's that sort of slight tension that, of course, you're influenced by them, but also you want to find your own space. But it's important because, I mean, London's a big city. There are a lot of architects there. It's a very commercial city. It's quite difficult to maintain a kind of critical position and not to get either kind of expelled by commerce or sucked in to commerce. And so there's a group, and it's not just them, there's a few others as well, perhaps maybe not so well known outside of the UK, but that forms a sort of collegiate kind of group of colleagues that are supportive, that somehow feels, together you feel like you're not entirely on your own against, the big developers and all of that. So they're at lots of levels, they're very important to us. And we all, I mean, Adam Caruso is a professor at ETH, like me. Tony Fredton used to be. So we're also kind of quite close in that academic circle. And then in ETH, there's a sort of view of kind of English architects, whatever that is. And a student came up to me a couple of years ago and said to me, Mr. Emerson, I was in London last summer and I went to see Tate Britain. I really liked it. I thought it was a great project. Congratulations. I said, well, thank you very much, but it wasn't me. And his friend hit him with, it's the other one. So we get, we do get confused, but hey, that's fine.
There are several times during the project that we see that you take things as found, like something, incorporate an openness to incorporate things that exist is it all prefigured in the project, or can you improvise? Like
No, it's somewhere between the two. So how do we kind of accommodate those things? So things like Jürgen Teller's studio was designed as a completely pure new structure. And everything was, in fact, all three buildings were the same when we designed them. So they were all identical. And we knew that something would happen. We didn't know quite what. Both the program started influencing it, but particularly the site. So the brick wall, which is actually owned by Jürgen, so it was his legal right to demolish it. But we found out that the neighbours had grown all their climbing plants on it, and they built garden structures against it. And Jürgen was a bit like, well, it's a really mean thing to do, to knock that wall down and remake it when they've spent years putting their gardens on there. And he sort of said, well, can we just keep it? And we said, well, we could, it's a bit difficult, we have to prop it up, we have to do things to it. And he said, well, look, if we can keep it, keep it. I mean, I don't want to be a bad neighbour. And then we were, of course, delighted, because it was, first of all, it was a very generous thing to do to his neighbours, and it somehow introduced that first found bit, and then every time we found one that looked interesting, then we kept it. But I think it's a very particular property of working in London. London is a city that hates master plans. In fact, people have tried master planning London, and it's always failed. It's a city that hates concepts. It's a totally pragmatic city. It's not an ideological city. It's a pragmatic commercial city. It's about trade, and concepts get in the way. So you're always adjusting. If you try to be too pure, the city, the building culture, the economy will just resist you. So you have to be accommodating, and then it's much easier and somehow much richer. But I think, let's say, the project in Cambridge has none of that, because the situation was completely sort of new field.
Tell us something about the drawing that you used in the studio. You have shown us these black and white hand drawings as a sort of synthesis tool that you ask students to sort of reinterpret what their impressions of the environment.
Yeah, so basically all of these drawings that form all of the atlases are all line drawings, one line thickness, in black. No hatches allowed. It's brutal. So there are a few reasons for that. I would say perhaps not insignificant, but entirely superficial one, if they make beautiful drawings. I think that is part of our business, to make beautiful things. Probably more seriously, it is a way that, let's say, you can get a very large group of students, actually a very large group of students working on opposite sides of the world, Lima, Zurich, to make a piece of research, to do a piece of work, to bring it together, and for it to become one collective document. If everybody draws with their own style, then the thing ends up being kind of permanently fractured. The idea of folding it through itself. The drawings that I picked today, I didn't pick thematically or by person. I didn't pick a series that were like, oh, these are Peruvian students, these are Swiss students. It was more, which ones take me through a certain view of the place. So to draw in line work is a way of making the documents collective and making them available. There's another reason for that, is that it makes you incredibly attentive to how the subject that you're drawing. Because if you've got every colour and every texture, then you can do green for grass, grey for concrete, and everything is like a kind of caricature. If you've only got one line, that line has got to go along here as concrete and then change to earth. You've really got to understand the structure of earth to understand how that line is going to change character, because it's the same thing, but it has to behave differently. And so one of the things that I think is nice about the drawings is how inventive they are and how precise they are in a kind of material culture without having any colour or hatches. But every drawing is always matched by a photograph. So there is this kind of idea that the photograph restores colour and texture and shadow and all of those things, which the drawing does not. And then the drawings, there's another rule, which is partially followed, but it's that the drawings are always in the scales of 5. 50,000, 5,000, 500, 50, and 5. So that every drawing, by jumping scales like that, it's not like the drawing telescopes into the thing. It's almost like this drawing has a territorial scale, this one has a constructional one. And it's a different idea of what the drawing, and then at their best is when then one weaves through another. So you can get, I don't know, the ceiling of a building and a map of America, and you suddenly realize that the American interior is only ever a kind of a representation of the American landscape, or something like that. Well, there was a very nice one where a student had drawn through the Esteras with a sort of similar kind of woven texture to the informal city. And it somehow, of course, it's a visual rhyme and it's a sort of formal thing, but at the same time, it makes you very aware of the different kind of cultural output of a particular place. If we did those drawings, let's say, to London, you would never get a bit of grid, neither in material culture nor in territorial one. Just the city just won't produce it. Whereas here, I always like the fact that they call it an informal settlement, and then you look at the plan, and it's like this kind of grid, like Savannah or something. But it's kind of informal in a kind of more legal and in a kind of use and development way, rather than spatially, it's incredibly well organized. But somehow those line drawings end up being able to make some of those relations, which I think more privatized drawing, and I have nothing against people being expressive, but for these documents, it's really nice when you bring them together and you can say there is a document. And I think it's on the wall at the moment. And actually, you know, I can't always tell, let's say, which ones are Peruvian students and which ones are Swiss ones. Some of them you can, which is nice that there is a little bit, you know, even if you try to get rid of the kind of the fingerprint, you can go up to a point and not all the way. But I think that that's why the drawings that, let's say, were done maybe 6 years ago are still talking, is because they have this kind of economy.
Can you say a little more about the drawings? Because I found it really interesting at the beginning because we insist, because I was curious that the atlas was surveyed. They had to draw and to understand how the wall is made. And at the end, when you put all the drawings together, kind of produce a sort of new reality, like a fictional reality. So can you explain maybe what the role of the drawing?
I suppose okay, go back a second. I think you've sort of described it really well, actually, what the aim is. But one of the aims is to try to break that, I think, very artificial relationship there is between the kind of analytical part of an architect's production of architecture and a synthetic one. Yeah, the idea that I am doing some mapping or I'm doing some analysis or some references, and then now I've finished the analysis, I'm going to go and do some design work. I think the idea is that the survey is design, because you're inventing stuff. I mean, surveys are not true. You know, even if you measure them, they are extremely selective. I think that what the students put into the atlases are highly synthetic. I mean, and also what they don't show as much as what they do show. And essentially, in the end, they are, sometimes without being conscious of it, designing through a certain way of seeing that particular place in a very, very precise way. And then doing a design project after the atlas is completely different to doing one with off a blank sheet of paper. It's also quite nice because it means you never have a blank sheet of paper. There's always this sort of there's always a drawing that's available for you to work on, because that's the way that we use them, is that then from the atlas into the proposals, that you make your proposal on to the drawing. The site becomes the atlas, not the place. The place is over there. The place is not in the studio. The atlas is in the studio. So you can somehow, maybe your project is a very small adjustment, a small adjustment to some of those territorial lines, particularly in Pachacamac, where it's all about these very fine, like this kind of one wall or one ditch, or these kind of linear structures that completely change the territory from one side to the other. So actually, to slightly subvert one of those, and the whole place changes. So I think it's kind of, to me, as you say, it kind of creates a new reality. It is a kind of fiction. All surveys are, even the kind of the great. There was a great survey in the 18th century by Robert Adam, Scottish architect, who surveyed Diocletian's palace in Split. And so he surveyed what he saw, and then he did a second survey, which is how he thought Diocletian's palace was when it was fully done. Now, he didn't know, but that survey became the template for English neoclassical architecture for 100 years. It became a kind of form of fact, and then everybody went to it, and he'd invented it. Okay, some of it were a bit true, but a lot of it wasn't. Same with Piranesi. I mean, a lot of Piranesi's Antiquite Romane he drew them before Rome had been excavated. So he saw a little corner of stone and went, aha, I can see a civilization there, and I'll show it to you. Right, which is sort of amazing. And so the survey is totally, I think, totally synthetic, totally creative.
It's also really powerful because at the same time drawing is it's not judgmental. At the same time also it's not neutral.
Yeah.
And I think in Pachacamac students was pretty powerful because they discover they reread the context and the territory in another way. Because just was one line.
It's funny, they don't.
One less brutal than reality.
I would say that the drawings that I've seen from atlases have ranged from, you could say, the incredibly sort of objective neutral, or aiming to be, or the pretense, very, very straight, like this is how I saw it, this is how I measured it. There's a side of them where they become incredibly romantic, where it's this sort of idealization of a place, where they will ignore everything that doesn't somehow confirm a certain perception of the place. And then you get some which are incredibly critical and quite angry, where they will demonstrate what they see as to be all the injustices of the world in the drawing. And I really like the fact that they are capable of carrying a kind of political or emotional energy without, as you say, being judgmental, without being somehow finger-wagging. They're just, and some of them, particularly from Glasgow, they were very angry with the drawings. I think students felt like somehow the world had been very unfair to that city, had dumped it, perhaps government, perhaps commerce, perhaps other things. But this was a great city which, for no fault of its own, had fallen on desperate times. And it was really interesting, whereas the fourth one, super romantic. I mean, these forests growing through factories, I mean, what's not to like? Everything was beautiful. I mean, everything was collapsing, but it was really beautiful.
Is there the idea of nature in your talk, your presentation? Was always a sort of anchor to the reality? Is that idea a way of avoiding context in a way, or trying to sustain the idea of the architecture as an autonomous practice into your view?
I have to admit, I haven't thought about it in those terms. I mean, firstly, let's say the crudest answer is, I think our work's a lot about context. I mean, whether it be in the teaching work or in the practice. Perhaps, yes, some idea of nature maybe, yes, I think you might be right that there is some idea of maybe trying to reframe what the expectation of context is. I admit, it's one of those terms, particularly in the UK, where context, I think, carries too much legal, political, emotional energy. I mean, context caused Brexit, right? I mean, it's a real problem. This idea that you walk around and there is this kind of evidence of empire everywhere, in every pub, in every street, in every bit of parkland. I mean, great parks, beautiful parks, but that had to be a very rich culture, had to produce those. And I think that there is a side where the context, or the raising of context as a sort of instrument, turns a culture very, very conservative. I mean, UK now. So maybe to find another frame like natural history and an idea of nature is maybe one in which you can somehow talk about the same things, but on the different terms. I mean, the natural history is full of history, but it's not context in the same way.
And going back to the drawings, this like fictional surveys that you are doing with your students, is it that it's a way of teaching or making students learn about taking care of what is there in the project? Because I there's a very strong relationship between this drawing, the fact that you make these atlases, and your work. So they are all about taking care or nurturing what is there in order to put another layer. So the question is, have you thought about, or have you already done an atlas of your work?
I mean, you're absolutely right in the sense that the methodology of the atlas is about looking really, really carefully, and not just taking care of what you look at, but taking care about how you represent it. And that care as a sort of kind of latent theme should be much more, I think as a culture we should be more careful, basically. We should take more care. So yeah, no, never done one of our work. I think probably a bit too early. I don't know, I think that I mean, one of the nice things about doing an atlas, particularly in a place that you don't know, so we've never done one in London, for example. I suspect that we would do quite a bad one, or at least if I was involved, because I'm full of prejudice about the place. Somebody said, I'm going to go do that, and I'll go, no, don't look at that, it's rubbish, right? The nice thing about doing atlases in places you don't know is you have the outsider's eye, and then you're both naive, but also you can see things clearly in a way in which, so I think somehow to do a self-reflective atlas would probably be quite difficult. I think you do, yeah, and I think it was really, in fact, there's I think 2 drawings in the atlas by Swiss students that were done, the students actually hadn't been here, so in March, for whatever reason, they weren't able to come, so there was and then it was their friends who collected the material photographically and so on, and then they made their atlas. And then it was actually quite interesting. I think Damon was one of them, and we're going to the site, and then he goes, "It's really like the drawing," right? So the whole idea of what is place, but it was kind of, you know, and I think that his colleagues, you know, and I think that because when they were doing the atlas, there was also a kind of correspondence between ETH and here with material, photographs. I think some people went back and photographed something again because they were in the middle of drawing, and then, you know, so there was a kind of, I think the outsider's view is somehow central to it, or at least we've never tried one where it's really super familiar. That's a very nice response. I mean, we have had, when we did the fourth one, Glasgow and Galway in Ireland, all of them, after we did them, we did an exhibition in the city in which they were made, which is really scary, right? Because they're all three, particularly Galway and Glasgow, are very proud cities. And you know, you don't want to be making a joke or a caricature, or and so there's always that sense that worry that somebody might say, look, that's just naive. You can't just come into a place and then just sort of make a pretty drawing and then you know, think that's okay, because you've got to understand stuff. You know, it's not neutral. Every time we've done it so far, people have generally had that reaction of, like, they see it and go, wow, Glasgow looks great. You know, and somehow with pride that somehow they've seen elements of the city that they hadn't seen before, which you needed the naivety of a foreigner to do. And even sometimes where in Glasgow, a friend who hosted it, a little bit like what you're doing now, like somebody in Glasgow hosted us, saw the atlas and saw one section of the atlas, which was in the part of town that he was there going, wow, that's the bit of town you really don't go in. You know, I mean, it's really dangerous. You know, but then you had a couple of kind of naive Swiss students just drifting around, and I think that they were so foreign that they weren't, you know, if I went, I would have been in trouble with an English accent. A couple of Swiss students. Yeah, a couple of Swiss students, but they're somehow, they're not engaged in whatever particular conflicts or tensions are going on. And actually, as long as they always behave brilliantly and openly, and generally they get on very well with all the people that they, even if some of them think that they're really quite eccentric. You know, when you get some backhole in Glasgow, so you've come all the way from Zurich to survey this yard. Like, really? I mean, don't you have a really pretty landscape to enjoy? But no, generally it's a very kind of, I think, both ways enriching process.
You use the expression material culture, which I think was very interesting because it blurs a little bit the distinction between the artificial and natural, and it's a way of observation. You describe it very beautifully when you say the same line that was drawing a building, then starts drawing the natural ground, the sand, the earth, you know? And then, I don't know, I found there was a sort of guideline to understand your work, and at the same time the pedagogical importance of observation, this idea of material culture, which is understanding through materials, through texture,
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. It's one of the things I'm most interested in. I mean, when we arrived last week and walked into this the equivalent of this room 3 buildings along. You know, I looked up and I thought, I'm in South America. Right? That ceiling doesn't exist in this way in Europe. You know, I think every culture has such, sort of in a sense, pronounced, puts down evidence of its culture everywhere, all the time. And it's one of the most kind of, I think as an architect, one of the most exciting things to try to read and try to work out what is going on, why is, I was thinking when I was showing Jürgen's, and actually Churchill's with all this kind of concrete, I was thinking, I can't believe I'm showing European concrete to South Americans. I mean, because it's pretty lightweight stuff, right? I know where the hierarchy, who owns really amazing concrete. So, but it also has a different, even from the UK to Switzerland to Germany, this room in concrete would always be different, would always have different edges, different thicknesses, different tolerances, and then the character would be different. And I think that that's something that as architects, if we can start reading more effectively, I think we can then also kind of act more effectively. And the same applies to landscape, to horticulture, to the colour of the sky. I mean, this is a very particular shade of grey, right? But also a very particular kind of temperature, humidity, which I haven't really experienced before. This is so kind of even just getting used to certain climatic changes, and then you start understanding the architecture a bit better, because you suddenly go, well, of course. I mean, the glazing, let's say, all the windows, there's a kind of fineness to it, right? Particularly in the neighbourhood that we're staying in. All the glazing slides, I think it's like 8mm thick. So it's like, how about, now for us, like that is a thin frame, So we just can't do that anymore because the climate won't allow it. So as a kind of material culture, I think we carry all of these things, and at best we share them. And then that's, I think, the most exciting bit.
Yeah, we can go to yeah.